Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much, Cindy, and thank you, Judy, for that wonderful opening prayer to really center us. And thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. So as Jennifer was saying, my name is Brittany. I am a Chief and a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I've worked at the Caring Society since 2017. And so it's a real honor to be able to present some of this work with you guys. So I think it's Tracy who's advancing the slides. So Tracy, you can press the next slide. Perfect. So as Cindy was saying, I'm going to be discussing the back to basics approach. And this approach really stems from about October 2021, when the parties, so the Caring Society, Assembly of First Nations, and Canada entered into negotiations to try and reach an agreement to end the Canadian government's discrimination against First Nations kids. During these negotiations, it was agreed that quite literally a back to basics approach to Jordan's Principle was required to try to get Indigenous Services Canada closer to compliance with the tribunal orders, and to really ensure that things were changing at the level of kids and families. So essentially, the standard operating procedure that really guided Canada's implementation of Jordan's Principle up to that point was essentially thrown out. And the back to basics approach was put together by the parties. And so really importantly, it applies to all Indigenous Services Canada staff working on Jordan's Principle. So it's not just the focal points who might be receiving the requests, but it's also like the financial staff, it's the executive, so on and so forth. And it was, I would say, implemented in about early 2022. Go to the next slide. So some of the key elements of back to basics is it's one, rooted in non-discrimination. So it's essentially ensuring that it's getting to the essence of Jordan's Principle, which is making sure that First Nations kids can get the services they need when they need them, right? It centers the children's needs and their best interests. And it must consider distinct community circumstances as well. So all those three things must be at the very foundation of Canada's approach to implementing Jordan's Principle. And part of the reason why those are really baked into back to basics is because that's what Canada was ordered to do via the tribunal orders on Jordan's Principle. And of course, there's been a number of them on Jordan's Principle, so I very much encourage you guys to read those orders. We do also have an information sheet. It also, the approach also says that Jordan's Principle must be simple to access for families. So families need to be able to get a hold of somebody if they have questions about how to access Jordan's Principle. It must be timely. So what that means is Canada must comply, or ISC must comply with the tribunal orders on the determination timelines. So for example, 48 hours, Canada has 48 hours to determine a non-urgent individual request. So these aren't guidelines or goals, these are human rights orders, those timelines. It must reduce the administrative burden on families. So making sure that, families don't need to submit reams of documentation, an assessment, so on and so forth, to get to a determination, for example. And it really says that ISC must exercise compassion, common sense, and a reconciliation first approach when implementing Jordan's Principle. And finally, it must ensure substantive equality. So essentially the equality in outcomes. So ensuring that First Nations kids get the services and supports that they need to have culture relevant service provision, for example, to ensure they have access to language and culture and ceremonies, to ensure that they have the things that they need, not just for their needs now, but in the future as well. Tracy, you can hit the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, and I think just one back. There we go. Thank you. So back to basics, really, when we talked about it amongst the parties, it was agreed that, as I said, the standard operating procedure wasn't working. And there was a few components that were really barriers to ensuring that Canada was reaching compliance with the tribunal orders. So for example, the back to basics approach at this point now presumes substantive equality. So you may remember pre-2022, families were actually having to write letters saying, this is how this request meets substantive equality for my child. So not only was this a tremendous amount of work for families and service coordinators, but it was very invasive and not dignified, right? So it was agreed that really in all requests, substantive equality needs to be presumed. And as well, reference to normative standards cannot be used to deny requests. So again, pre-2022, you may have received or seen denial letters saying, won't approve this request, or this request is going to be denied because it's above normative standard, right? Or we're only going to approve this request up to a certain amount because that is what the normative standard is in this particular province, right? Well, we know that this is not really aligned with the tribunal orders. And two, we know that so often First Nations kids are going to need and require services and supports beyond what they may ordinarily receive in the province, right? Another key presumption, professionals and elders and knowledge holders are acting within their area of expertise when making request or making a recommendation, I should say. So you may recall pre-2022 that ISK would often override professional letters of support saying, things like, well, this dentist is also conducting this service, so therefore we need a third letter of support, right? Well, this doesn't really jive with the fact that most professionals, if not all professionals, they can actually recommend a support if the child doesn't need it. It's against their own college bylaws, and it really amounts to additional administrative burdens and barriers for families. And it's also presumed that parents and guardians are acting in their child's best interest when consenting to a recommended service and support. So acknowledging that there is going to be no more questioning of the intention behind a request for a child. It's acknowledged that, yes, this parent is requesting this support and consenting to it and acknowledging that their child needs it. The request is specific to the child and their needs. So again, pre-2022, you may recall that in some cases you will have received a denial letter saying this request is not specific to the needs of the child, right? But it was really like a request saying this house needs to have a wheelchair accessible ramp, right? Yes, the child needs it because the child requires a wheelchair accessible ramp to get into their home, but it might have also been that ISK was viewing this as potentially other people in the family might benefit from that wheelchair accessible ramp, right? So acknowledging that requests are made specific to the children and their needs. And finally, for urgent requests, a minimum information is required for ISK to determine those requests. And risk mitigation plans must be put in place where the request is not likely to be determined within 6 hours of the 12-hour timeline. So as a reminder, for urgent requests, individual requests, the department has 12 hours to determine it. So if it seems unlikely they're going to reach that determination within 6 hours, they need to be working with the family and the circle of care to come up with a compassionate risk mitigation plan that meets the child's immediate needs. And so examples of urgent requests include end-of-life care, risk of child entering the child welfare system, etc. Next slide. Thank you, Tracy. So let's talk a little bit about documentation. So as I said, the back to basics approach is meant to really ensure that the administrative burden on families is minimized. So it is presumed that just one letter of support from a professional or an elder or knowledge keeper is required. So all requests just need one letter. ISK does not need a letter for every requested product, service, or support. So as we know, kids are going to have multiple needs. It's very rarely our needs short, discrete, and just one. So a letter of support can speak to multiple needs as long as it's within sort of the professional scope of practice. ISK does not need quotes, cost estimates, and length of service to determine the request. And finally, ISC will review any previous supports for the child and any relevant letters already on file to support this new request. As well, if, you know, let's say a child is receiving occupational therapy and the occupational therapist says, you know what, actually this kid is going to need another 6 months of services to meet their needs. The letter, the professional need only write to the department saying, hey, this is my professional recommendation. The kid needs to continue these services, rather than the family having to make a whole new request, right? Again, going back to it's really reducing the barriers and burden on families. And again, in urgent cases, only verbal or written consent from the parent or guardian is needed, and documentation can follow once the immediate needs are met for the kid. And I think that's might be, yeah, so I've included some information for use here, information sheets and things like this. But to learn more about the Back to Basics approach and reference, as I said, I made reference to some of the tribunal orders on Jordan's principle. So I'd really encourage you to check out those information sheets as well. And that wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Brittany, and just recognition to Brittany and also our colleagues, Jennifer King and Molly Rasmussen, who had done some great work on Jordan's principle nationally.